I probably would say that for me, it's as important for me to resist as it is to accept the Catholic tradition.
Okay.
And so I feel like since I've come to Union, which is in 1976, I had at one moment at one moment in time I feel very lucky to be part of the Catholic tradition because it's emphasis on social justice. And yet, liturgically, I feel very restricted as a Roman Catholic. And so I think that, I remember Robert McAfee Brown saying to one of the first courses I took here, he had been to the Vatican Council and he was full of appreciation then for the Catholic tradition, and I was too. But now, I feel very, very restricted. And so when I think of the Catholic tradition, I have to see it in a small c. I have really very deep roots now in Protestant traditions that I have come to see here at Union Seminary. And I don't give priority to a Catholic religion. And I feel very, very grateful to the Jews at Central Synagogue who have shaped me entirely differently and who have given me space actually to do liturgical work that my own Catholic tradition would bar me from doing.
So if you were to identify one or two theological elements in the Protestant and the Jewish traditions that have fed you, what would they be?
I would say that what I have learned from Protestants is that you can reform traditions. And that we, like in the Catholic tradition, we had that. We lost it for many hundreds of years. In the Vatican Council, we set out to do it. But at the present time, our Catholic tradition, liturgically, I'm speaking primarily, is withdrawing from that kind of reform. So I feel very strongly that we have to be open to something new happening and take it up and try it out and not be held down by the top. And among Jews, I can hardly believe that they can be so accepting of a person who is Catholic directing the renewal of their liturgical work. So it's a kind of hospitality, it's a kind of risk-taking, and it's a kind of what I think is seeing beyond myself to invite me into doing something myself.
I think in my own roots, a couple of other things I've mentioned is that I inherited, I think, with my denomination, a deep love of the Bible and a personal faith. I think from my earliest memories of being in church, those are probably things that I saw and heard, is that this is really something that people ought to understand for themselves and can understand for themselves and really ought to take it on. Later in my own denomination, that love became a very narrow kind of fundamentalism that I had to leave. And it's, over the years, I think, trying to find a way to hold in tension a respect and love for this book that we receive and a strong, fervent faith that I see in many people and people within my denomination and the school, and also resist the tendencies to narrow that in ways that don't allow conversation, shut people out. I think, like Janet, being here is so wonderful because we're able to be in conversation with other traditions. And I think I've learned a tremendous amount from Catholics. I think the Vatican II's message around participation is just such a wonderful message for all the church. I think the gifts of learning, of careful speaking, of different ways of participating, of singing, really just have nurtured me in so many ways. And I think it's this place that we work in is so wonderful because we can see the gifts of those various denominations, traditions together. So our theology of ministry draws on those roots that are it's hard to leave, particularly, I think most of us have these things that are embodied in us from our earliest memories, but also continually shaped in these conversations with unexpected parties, whether, Jewish, but all the other traditions around us.
It's hard for me to separate out all those strands, I think. I mean, I have been a Lutheran all my life, and part of it is very cultural. I mean, it's very Swedish, and, to sort of separate out what is really Swedish and what is really Lutheran would be kind of hard. I mean, it makes me both very respectful of the particularity of a tradition, of a culture, that I think there is something about Swedish Lutheran heritage that's very particular. It can also be so rigid that it has kept other people out. I mean, I think that's been one of the reasons it's hard for the Lutheran Church in this country to really reach out to new neighborhoods, because, you've said, well, geez, why would you come? You're not Swedish. I mean, so I mean, I think we've had a hard time cracking that open. But I mean, I did my internship in a parish that was an all African American parish on Long Island. So, I mean, this wasn't a Swedish parish at all. I mean, and it taught me a tremendous amount. I mean, it was just a new way of worshiping, and I mean, new friendships that I just didn't have, growing up in a little town in Iowa. But I really want to honor the particularity of all those different cultural traditions. Where, I mean, maybe this goes back to the cauldron of not making them into one big mush, but keeping the particularities of them. I grew up also like Troy. I mean, with a deep love of the Bible, and in a very kind of pietistic family. Kind of a suspicion of drinking, and well, not only a suspicion. I mean, certain moralistic kind of rules. So I grew up with that, and have had to, ask questions about a lot of the things that I was taught. But I think in terms of Lutheran theological convictions, I mean, we're just, the teaching about grace is very, very strong. I mean, and it doesn't leave me, I mean, if there's a bottom line, it would be grace, I mean, I remember one of our bishops, years ago, his own son committed suicide, and he talked about he said, I have been to the bottom of this pit, and it was there that I felt the grace of God holding me up, I mean, I hear that kind of story over and over, and I think it's really very true. Even if you go to Bonhoeffer's critique of that, of cheap grace, I mean, I think that's where you have to look at Lutheran theology and ask some serious questions. But I think also Mary and I are teaching this course now about teaching and preaching the cross, and there's been a very strong emphasis on the cross in Lutheran theology, that the cross is there in the midst of whatever suffering you're going through. I mean, it's more that, that's my memory of that teaching, that there's nothing you can go through that God hasn't already been through. So, I mean, I think that was also a very strong kind of teaching in my own memory. And like Janet, I have a lot of questions about, certain things. The Lutheran Church can become very rigid. I think any strongly confessional church can become rigid, and if you're outside of those confessions, you don't fit. But if it's really opened up, then I think if the message truly is grace alone, then the boundaries really expand. But if it's, no, you have to believe grace this way, then it sort of cuts out everybody that doesn't believe that same way.
Yeah.
So grace and cross still play an important role in your theology and your ministry, right?
Right, and I'm sort of standing in two worlds, Sue. I mean, for years I was only in the congregation. I was a parish pastor, and now I'm, full-time teaching here, but also this one foot is also as part of the clergy team at Advent Lutheran Church. And then when I was in the parish, we also shared space with Beth Am, which was a Reformed Jewish congregation. It completely expanded my thinking about Jewish people. I mean, I probably had never had a conversation with a Jewish person. That's terrible to think about. You know, by then I was 30 years old. But where would I do that? Not in Gallery, Iowa, not at Augustana College. You know, not really when I was in St. Paul and Minneapolis. I mean, so it just completely opened things up for me. I mean, and just in a way, the people in that congregation worked with text. We did a text study together, and we hardly could get through one verse, you know, just looking at every word. Well, you know this, Mary, but. So, I mean, I think my experience has been a constant opening up rather than a closing down in terms of my own tradition or looking at other people's traditions. And I think that's the wonderful thing about this place. You know, you're constantly having to say, oh, I had no idea that was going on, or you thought that, or.
So a word that I use, I'm really committed to trying to foster religious pluralism, but I don't think we contribute to that as much if we don't have a textured particularity of our own religious identity. In other words, I don't think it's just kind of a, you know, anything you want to believe. And by textured, I mean that it's something that you can be a loyal critic, you understand, you have to be able to be self-critical of your tradition, so that, you know, and I think, well, being at Union, that's not so hard. But I'm thinking of kind of two childhood stories that show, one is when I was about 7. I'm from Seattle, so it's a very different, it's much more secular and much more religiously diverse. In fact, it's the least affiliated state with Oregon in terms of religious belonging. But anyway, one of our Protestant neighbors asked me if we could read the Bible. So I went home and I asked my mother, can we read the Bible? And she said, yes, she thought so. But we didn't have one. And but I came to the Bible in college. Yeah, this was one of the results of Vatican II.
Wow.
And while I came late to it, I think I love it no less. And one of the things that, you know, I can be extremely critical, of course, as Janet can be about the Catholic Church. Although I refuse to cede the Catholic Church to the hierarchy or to the Vatican or whatever, but it has some very powerful ways of interpreting Scripture. And I mean, this is something that's, you know, only 40-some years old, but it's, you know, it's something that sort of, we may have come late, but we're really, you know, and it's ecumenically, I think that's been a huge advantage for us. But the other is about Jews. My family, I like to say, has been leading Jews astray for several generations because my grandparents lived in St. Paul, Minnesota, next door to an Orthodox Jewish family.
Wow.
And when the Jewish, my grandparents had 4 children, and the Jewish family had, I guess, a comparable number. So the mothers would, you know, babysit. But when the Jewish kids reached a certain age, when they wanted to push back about keeping kosher, she said, you go see Mrs. Wagner, and that was my grandmother. So my grandmother was feeding these kids ham. But it was a wonderful thing that, you know, like, it's a great example of to me, textured particularism. In our home, we keep kosher. That's part of our Jewish identity. If you think you have to try it, well, then go next door to the Catholic Mrs. Wagner. But anyway, it's sort of a silly story, but not. I mean, and even though I came to my connection with Jews really in my early 30s to be doing a lot of work with Jews, I think some of those childhood things, I think somehow hearing those stories growing up, or, you know.
Because we were afraid of Catholics when I
Well, you
was
should have
growing up. Yeah, I mean,
You seem to do okay with us now, though.
yeah, I've opened my mind and my heart.
It goes to show you the power of grace.
Yeah, right.